I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all about my ongoing work in the Andes as it relates to human-animal interactions, and then specifically how that intersects with music. So as you said, Sarah, and from those of you that know me, I am anthropologically trained archaeologist, and I in my work hope to better understand how the lives of humans as well as non-human beings, specifically animals, shape their mutual experiences in the world, and how our interpretation of past practices and beliefs can be inclusive of different definitions of what it is to be non-human, as well as human. So before I begin this specific talk discussing the project that we undertook at the site of La Real, I wanted to point out that my work is collaborative and is mutually dependent on the work, ideas, and initiatives of my colleagues, in particular Luis Manuel Gonzalez, Willy Yepes, and Justin Jennings, in the context of this particular research project. Luis Manuel is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, as well as a research associate at the Archaeology Center at the University of Toronto. Willy Yepes is a local scholar based in Arequipa and affiliated with the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. And Justin Jennings is the curator of New World Cultures at the Royal Ontario Museum, as well as an associate professor at the University of Toronto. So I wanted to point that out because it's really important to set the stage about how we've co-created this project, as well as the dissemination of some of our collective ideas. So in my talk today, I want to lay the ground for kind of forwarding the argument for considering animals not only as non-human beings, but as agentive forces in the co-construction of human worlds, but also in specific moments and through specific practices, such as musical ones. They can form part of extended social as well as kinship networks. And I make this argument by considering the animal gaze through Andean ontologies and concepts of reciprocity. The Andes region is defined by stark vertical differences, what is termed the vertical archipelago, based on these ecological divergent points along this elevation change from the Pacific coast at sea level to the large mountain ranges over 6,000 meters above sea level. So this geographic variability was a very dynamic environment within which past communities and cultures cultivated very diverse crops and managed their livestock across a very distant locales. Communities did not engage in market trade, but were spatially dispersed at different altitudinal zones to exploit a wide range of resources. This economic arrangement was a very effective mode of resource diversification as well as risk prevention. And despite the difficulty of traversing these rugged terrains, communities throughout the Andes regularly crisscrossed what is dubbed the vertical archipelago and formulated very unique economic and social networks that formed the basis of a kinship system known as the Ayu, through which communities formed these distinct connections across ecological zones and held common ideas of origin or ancestor. So in order to set the stage for some of the concepts that I'll discuss and how it kind of informs ongoing interpretations of the artifacts from La Riel, I'd like to define a couple of key aspects and key terms in Andean worldview that help to shape my argument. So first, as I mentioned, the Ayu is a kinship system of a family clan that refers to a community of families often related by blood. But we also know in the definition of Ayu that there are concepts and related ideas of fictive kinship that do play a role in defining these kind of family units. These groups work in land, they work common land, common territories, and they reproduce social relationships through shared ritual practices and reciprocal processes of exchange of labor, services, as well as goods. And therefore, an IU is a landholding cooperation as well as a religious association. So it has sort of these multiple facets and roles in people's lives. And it can be variably designated and designate a few related families or potentially a larger polity that can number in the tens of thousands. So the IU is a very much a scalable family unit. So this system of both biological as well as social relatedness created a system of mutual aid that defined many community relations and a common idea or ethos of Andean kinship, kind of along a broader scale. Moiety, as well as dual organization, structured IU social relations, and this arrangement was often based on the idea of hierarchy or asymmetry that paired upper or Hanan and lower Hurin Moi divisions that were headed by chiefs or kurakas, these sort of local leaders. And IUs are particularly important for my discussion not only of musical practice, but how we interpret then the way in which musical instruments are produced because of the way in which IUs are nested, ranked, and homologous, in which groups of moieties were both organized in dual as well as quadripartite divisions of social organization. So this really structured how people then came to these large ceremonial events through which they were able to express and participate in musical production. So embedded within IU structure is the concept of Aini. Aini is important because it is the idea of a reciprocal exchange, some sort of a give and take system that is oftentimes one that is delayed in one group receiving a sort of returned value for labor after the fact. And different moiety groups would share labor responsibilities in maintaining canals, for example, agricultural fields, as well as hosting festivals and feasts, again, which is where we start to see the potential of interpreting musical practice through some of these Andean concepts. An important component of Aini is that, again, this reciprocal exchange of labor, and it was understood to extend among human groups, but also within one's environment, and through which the interaction of human groups had with plants and animals who inhabited those spaces. So within the ontological and sort of worldview structures of Indian peoples, there were these sort of mutual enveloping structures that defined interrelationships not only between people, but also non-humans and the environment. And this is really significant for looking at animal remains as those materials used for things like musical instruments. So I wanted to just define one other term, just so that we're on the same page about how these sort of structures inform our interpretations, looking at this material record, as well as how it is applicable to sort of broader studies in the Andes. So one of the final components that's really significant when we start to sort of think about how we make sense of sort of these specific contexts and collections that we look at is the concept of synecdoche. So synecdoche is sort of on a quick note and a quick way to define it is one where parts can represent the whole, and a whole sort of concept or entity can be represented by a part. A really important ethnographer, sociocultural anthropologist, and ethnohistorian, Catherine Allen, notes that synecdochal thinking comprehends the world in terms of mutually enveloping homologous structures that act upon each other. As I said, IUs are contained in IUs, places are contained within places. Every potato field contains its own vertical ecology, thus every microcosm energizes its macrocosm and vice versa. So this idea of envelopment and mutual dependency very much underpins many Andean concepts and many social interactions within the Andes, both in the present and in the past. And the work of Mary Weismantel as well argues that together, dualism, synecdoche, and verticality were seen as giving rise to a vision of the universe in which each living thing is both internally multiple and externally expansive, since it contains divisions and in itself is a division within a larger entity. So again, this idea that we are a part of something bigger very much underpins many of these Andean concepts that do inform our interpretations for this project, as well as in kind of broader research projects. So my work seeks to explore the possibilities of archaeological interpretation by expanding our gaze to non-human actors. And for the other zooarchaeologists in this virtual space, hopefully can sort of have a link into some of my ideas on this particular slide. But I seek in particular to connect the lines of evidence that we do have at our fingertips to the sort of larger ontological structures that exist in the Andes and as well as in other contexts in the past, to begin to shed light on the way that animals may have held these forceful agentive roles in human societies. So in the process of putting together the scope of this paper, I posed the broader question to myself: what can we learn about the human past through non-human beings in the context of musical practice? And my contribution to this discussion stems from a sort of broader dissatisfaction that I have towards the tendency, not only in zooarchaeological work, but oftentimes and through research projects focused on food and diet, to examine and interpret kind of the caloric and general economic contribution of non-human animals to daily meals, feasts, and exchange in the past. But many years of research in the Andes has demonstrated to me that animals are not passive beings to be exploited by humans. Rather, their role in human societies are actively shaped by the constraints and affordances of different species and their relationships to humans, both at an individual as well as population level. In the Andes, both wild and domestic species were valued for their behavioral tendencies and their contribution to political control. Whether it be the condor, the deer, jaguars, or camelids, these animals were differentially valued as food items as well as ceremonial offerings. And in this talk, I'd like to share this example around musical production using animal remains as a way to sort of have an entry point into some of these interpretations and sort of broader discussions. We know that in the Andes, camelid husbandry, for example, proliferated for millennia, for multiple generations, from their domestication over 6,000 years ago to their contemporary use in communities today for transportation. The lives and life histories of these animals were inextricably tethered to humans. Interpreting the use and value of these animals in past lifeways has concentrated on the economic importance of herds as sources of meat and labor for exchange. However, their incorporation into daily tasks managed by small-scale communities begs for closer examination of the value attributed to these animals as herding companions and as symbols of community affiliation, especially when we think about the use of particularly camelid remains, both in daily contexts as well as in mortuary ones. So the potential for understanding these animals and their role in past practice and belief is enhanced by taking a multi-species approach to the archaeological record. I would like to argue that this framework provides several advantages for archaeological interpretations of not only human and non-human interactions, but kind of broader scopes of culture and social practice. A multi-species approach considers variable relations that exist for communities that are not always defined as humans. This framework also inherently accounts for differing types of care and attention to the needs, constraints, as well as affordances of non-human beings. And animals in the present and past place demands on human populations. Thus, their role was not one that was inherently passive, but rather a constant source of labor and of thought. And then finally, multi-species approaches in anthropology, archaeology, geography, and philosophy are some of the ways and some of the frameworks that we can use that are holistic and can account for some of the compelling ways that animals can have these agentive roles in people's lives that not only impact and influence, but can really transform human experiences. And that transformative element of the role of animals in people's lives can very much be ones that are acoustically related. So a Western Cartesian ontology commonly separates human, animal, and place, but in the Andes, in many contexts, and we don't want to homogenize all of the Andes, but in many contexts, these entities are inextricably interconnected into these sort of integrated and variable assemblages. Animals in particular can be ideal models for people to conceptualize their own humanity, define the movements of celestial bodies, as you can see in some of the images here, as well as ensure the renewal of life. For example, among communities of Paquaritambo, Cusco, specific animal species are associated with particular animal life or human life stages. Deer or springborn animals are associated with newborn babies, while pumas are associated with elders or grandparents. These affiliations with specific animals that vary in distinct life stages highlights an underlying ontological structure that, at least in some parts of the Andes, incorporated not solely animal images, but the animal temperament and behavior as key aspects of defining human. The power of animals to denote, connote, and classify also attests to their profound social agency. And in the Andes, some scholars have considered animals as metaphors for specific groups of people, depending on their class, their status, as well as their political affiliation. In Amazonian contexts, we know that scholars like Viveros de Castro contend that self, knowledge, and one's perspective of the world are determined by one's corporeal structure, one's corporeal being of distinct species, while what is internal or what is cultural is constant and nature is variable or multinatural. So the assembling of different actors, human and non-human, partially determines their role as powerful agents, and recognizing the role of non-human beings, specifically animals, as beyond exploitable resources. Acknowledging that animals can also have these sort of personified roles, could be considered persons, permits our interpretation in nuanced ways of their active role in commensal, daily, ceremonial, as well as sociopolitical interactions. So we know that in order to enter this discussion of understanding human and animal relationality in the past, we do need to recognize the possibility of and recognize the impact of different ontological structures. And I preface the kind of following discussion by stating that in no way am I trying to homogenize all Andean cultures and worldviews in both past or present, but that there may be meaningful concepts to draw from to make sense of the complex networks of human and non-human mutuality as well as exchange. The relationship between many indigenous Andeans communities and non-human entities rests in the belief that some non-human beings contain what is dubbed well-being or understanding the well-being of their human owners, as Catherine Allen has discussed. For example, in Catherine Allen's work, small stone objects described as living ones as well as loving ones are thought to be gifts bestowed by powerful places that control, quote, the vitality and reproduction of herd animals, for example, end quote. The basis of these concepts stems from reciprocal relationships of mutual aid. So again, these sort of shared labor responsibilities. And Catherine Allen's seminal ethnographic research among the Sonco of Cusco highlights conscious reciprocity between human members resting in modes of Aini as well as Minka. The sharing of work among kin, both human and non-human, is the basis of Aini, while Minka is another concept that defines asymmetrical relationships based on one party owing service or labor to another. So this idea of sharing labor is one that is not solely defined between human groups, but can also incorporate animal labor as well. So in the Andes, the pre-colonial kinship reckoning was not one that was exclusively patrilineal, but instead based in a system of what is known as bilateral filiation. Men were they considered themselves to be descended from and in the agnatic line, and women in the uterine line. Penelope Dransart, another ethnographer who's worked extensively in Isluga, Chile, emphasizes that among herding communities in Isluga, Chile, kinship systems were not exclusively patrilineal or patriarchal. In fact, the dispersed pastoral way of life in Isluga did not foster context for the consolidation of power in a central authority. Rather, affiliations were located not just in the kinship domain, but in rituals, practices, and metaphors of everyday life, and in both reproductive and productive spheres of society. So the work of Penelope Dransart and Isluga reveals that herders recognize their camelids as individuals. During the Wainu ceremony, for example, the ears of llamas and alpacas are cut so that herders can distinguish herd animals, known as uiwa, owned by human beings, from wild unmarked camelids who are known as salja, which are a group of camelids that are not owned by people and are understood to belong to the spirits of the hills. So Dransart's work contends that, quote, the marking ceremonies Luga Chile likewise emphasizes the processes of gendering that occurred among lineages of both human and herd animal participants, end quote. So in the context of contemporary and past worldviews of the Andes, it's not simply a matter of homogenizing the concept of Ayu or Aini, but rather recognizing that Western Enlightenment notions of relatedness are not universal. Humans in the present and past did recognize animals at the individual level and started to understand and interact with them in very nuanced ways, depending upon those individual identities. So beliefs about how non-human entities are related to human communities then depend on the historical and environmental context, but also the daily subsistence practices that dictate temporalities and long-term activities. These intangible aspects of social practice are found still in the Andes region today, where scholars like Enrique Mayer notes, quote, a profound feeling of affect and respect that the peasant feels for Mother Earth, or the joy and gratitude towards mountain protectors the peasant experiences on the birth of an alpaca that's treated like a new daughter, end quote. So the kinship network of human societies therefore depends on the types of engagements that these communities have with the greater world. We know that non-human beings structure the lives of humans in various ways in the Andes. And again, these concepts of Aini and Minka do dictate the flow of energy through the Ayu as well as through different landscapes. And depending upon the human community, reciprocity and obligations in the Andes also extends to domestic animals and plants, animated places, and even to saints, as the work of Catherine Allen has identified. Water, we know, is this overarching entity that constituted a key element in the lives of contemporary and past communities in the Andes, as it was something that structured people's daily lives, as well as something that was recirculated through non-human entities. And you can see in the image here, the image you can see in this particular figure here, the image of the camelid, or what has been drawn in the form of a camelid at the top left of the yakana. So there are these ideas that specific celestial bodies in the shapes of animal figures, specifically camelids, were celestial bodies that perpetuated the circulation and flow of water. So again, it's not solely about water being the only key element, but these sort of non-human entities really shaping and structuring those resources. So setting up kind of where I'm coming from and situating these concepts in the Andes, I'd like to start to focus in on the case study that we published on in the paper in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology. And the talk is very much structured around the period of time known as the Middle Horizon. It begins around 600 CE, and it is known as the sort of Wari era in the South Central Andes. So the Middle Horizon Wari era at the site of La Real is an important concept and an important context through which to discuss the use as well as production of musical instruments. The Wari was an early state that predates the Inca, that many who don't work in the Andes or work in this region of the world who that know a lot about the Inca, but not as much about the Wari. But it's known as this pre-Inca state. It has been argued to be its own, and in itself, it's an empire. There's debates about that, and there's a lot of evidence to support sort of a state-level structure as well as an imperial structure. But nonetheless, its influence, Wari influence, extends from the southern Moquegua region in what is present-day present-day Peru, all the way to the northern region of Peru in the province of Cajamarca. We know that music is an important medium of entertainment throughout the Andes and specifically during the Wari era. We know that music was a key source of entertainment, a context through which and practices through which there would have been social exchange as well as ritual practice that allowed for different communities to come together. Preparation and musical activities involved more than just playing instruments that many of us know, but also the production of musical objects themselves and the shared knowledge around musical aesthetics. You can see images here from the pre-ceramic period contexts at Caral on the central coast of Peru, where we have bone aerophones that are produced from pelican and deer remains, with images of zoomorphic figures etched onto the instruments themselves. Although Western contemporary music is based on the idea of performance by specialists, many other sound-making traditions emphasize more collective experiences. The work of Chernow, for example, emphasizes that musical aesthetics in much of Africa, for example, are built around participation because music would have no meaning without group involvement. And similar importance is commonly placed on widespread musical participation in the Andes. Gender complementarity and balance form the basis of many musical experiences in the Bolivian Andes, for example. Henry Stobart invokes Aymara concepts that define balancing forces such as tada, as well as disequilibrium such as kiwa, to interpret the complementary nature of musical performance. These forces were in constant interaction, constantly negotiated, and local hosts in the community where Henry Stobart worked at Calanquita explained that it was a combination of both balancing forces, tara, as well as the disequilibrium of kiwa instruments that cause the rain to come and plants to grow. So musical practice and musical experience was not solely about aesthetics and entertainment, but very much the basis and the root of regeneration, renewal, as well as the passing of time. Work of Torfino stresses that the very concept of composer or soloist is not only absent, but also often actively discouraged in many musical traditions, as well as specifically in the Andes. And collective community participation in musical practice, along with consensus and equal opportunity to contribute, are valued individual talent. Were all valued as part of musical traditions. We know that musical practice is also a proxy for deeply held beliefs and ideologies. Ang, for example, notes that music is used to teach both certain Buddhist spiritual truths and to caution against overindulgence in some parts of Southeast Asia. And instruments in the Andes can be imbued with considerable animacy and power. And we know that ethnographic and archaeological research in the Andes does attest to music's important role in daily as well as seasonal practices. Sound can be equivalent to life and is key to healing. So it's very much also music is, again, something that is a part of well-being, understanding people's well-beings and perpetuating people's well-being through the regular use and practice of it. Music can also, as I said, highlight the passage of time with not only seasonal rains and marking aridity, but specific musical performance and using specific musical instruments can be either restricted to or the most appropriate for only specific times of year. Music does also tend to be situated around specific gender complementarity, as I said, such that performance can be seen as incomplete if only male or female parts are given. And we know that elsewhere in the Americas, caves, mountains, and other landscape features can be these spaces for most appropriate for musical performance, in addition to these built structures such as temples and other buildings. And as I said, kind of in our discussion before beginning, we know that in Nazca traditions, the sort of diversity of musical practice is one that is quite highly noted, such as the Grszoniska Zilowowska's work emphasizing the way that music is embroiled with political projects, the concentration and sort of drawing in of pilgrims to important sites in the Nazca region, such as the site of Kawachi, and then the musical diversity around these sort of diverse musical experiences people would have had when they visited the site of Kawachi, as well as other important centers. A really well-known example from the Andes, just to sort of take you all through one other example on the sort of musical tour throughout the region is at the site of Chavindohuantar and the use of Strombus trumpets, Strombus cell trumpets, that are turned into instruments known as pututos, that are not only produced and deposited at the site of Chavindohuantar, but would have likely been actively played in their subterranean galleries. And this would have influenced as one's experience during the ritual activities as groups of people and pilgrims would have descended into the subterranean galleries at the site. Both a play on the fluidity of sound and air, but at the site of Chavindohuantar, also the use of water and the flow of water would have also been quite significant. So the little that we do know of musical practice, specifically in the Majes Valley, the valley where La Real is located prior to the 9th century CE, suggests widespread participation in the manufacture and playing of bone aerophones, or instruments that we know create noise by pushing vibrating columns of air through them. Bone aerophones are common finds at the nearby cemetery site of Urraca, suggesting that the instruments were widely used in the first millennium CE. So you can see on this slide here, on the left, the 2 bone aerophones that are found at this neighboring site of Urraca, and then 2 examples of bone whistles that we identified from the site of La Real. So very, very similar shape, structure, specific selection of osteological elements are being undertaken at the site. The even earlier use of aerophones at the site of Urraca, which does slightly predate La Real, as well as contemporary practice in etchings at a nearby site of Cerro Muerto, one of the largest rock art complexes in the Americas, was first used in the first millennium BCE, where we see these dancing figures playing a range of musical instruments. And recent publications by Janusz Voloshin and colleagues have even identified or put forward the argument that these etchings, both in zigzag on the stone etchings, the petroglyphs, might even be depicting sound. So there's sort of a play on texture and image and imagery in some of these neighboring sites as it relates to musical practice. Sorgonishka has also made similar arguments about musical performance for the South Coast, more generally during the mid-first millennium BCE, and suggesting that musicians were deeply involved in the efficacy, the sort of success of ritual activities, rather than solely being mere producers of sound. That argument kind of, to begin with, is a little bit silly, but very much hitting home the point that it's more than just sound producing. It can be co-constructive as well as reshaping the social and political relationships between people. So to situate everyone in space, for those of you that did and have read our publication, you'll have seen this map before, but just to point out where we are in space, the Majes River Valley is south of what is the capital today of Peru, of Lima. Residents of the Majes were in the Middle Horizon period embroiled within kind of the angst and stress and tension of the expanding Wari state from the region of Ayacucho that you can see in the map here, demarcated in the top left of the map. So by the end of the 7th century, Wari influence would have been relatively deeply rooted in the valley, and over the next 3 centuries really shaped people's social and political relationships within the Majes Valley. We know that the initial emergence of the Wari around 600 CE was followed by this Wari polity's growing influence in neighboring highland regions, as well as coastal areas of the South Central Andes. And Wari musical tradition is not widely understood yet. There's been really extensive work done by Gudemos that argues that the Wari fostered a kind of what is dubbed musical shaman who communicated with the spiritual world on behalf of elites. And Gudemos's work suggests that these musician shamans often use the same kind of instruments, including bone aerophones, as had been employed by earlier groups that predated the Middle Horizon period. These individuals were highly skilled practitioners who were drawn from likely different ethnic groups and became members of Wari elite entourages. So the idea that as the state is expanding, specialists and individuals that had these very unique levels of training were drawn into the Wari political structure. And the Wari musical practice presented a very sort of radical departure from the kind of more collective Majes tradition that would have been in keeping with ethnographically observed Andean traditions of more collective musical practice rather than specialization. So we can see even within the Middle Horizon a sort of evolution of musical practice, or at least change over time. So La Real is a village context located in the middle Majes Valley, approximately 500 meters above sea level. The site sits below a contemporary village site of about 10 hectares, also named La Real. And residents of the modern La Real have routinely found objects and burials interred in and around their houses. So there's a long-term occupation and at the same time disruption of earlier pre-Hispanic contexts. An undisturbed portion of La Real Cemetery was discovered in the mid-90s during a construction project where Willie Yepes, our project collaborator, was an archaeologist working on the project, and the team, in addition to Willie's work, identified 2 principal areas and undertook emergency excavations before constructions could resume for this construction project. In the excavations that were undertaken in the mid-90s, 2 areas were demarcated: a mortuary cavern, as you can see on the image here at the top, as well as a 2-room semi-subterranean structure. Work that was done by Tiffany Tung as well as Justin Jennings in the late 2000s did radiocarbon date these 2 contexts, and they did differ in which phase in the Middle Horizon there was occupation and active mortuary practice. So the cave or cavern, mortuary cavern, dates to the earlier part of the Middle Horizon, between about 700 and 850 CE, and then this semi-subterranean structure dates to the later Middle Horizon, between about 900 and 1050 CE. Both contexts contain the contents of mummy bundles that were interred in batches and then intentionally slashed open, broken up, and partially burned as part of an ongoing mortuary process. So these were not mortuary contexts through which individuals were interred and the contexts were sealed, but rather there was likely active revisitation of these mortuary contexts and an active interaction with those mummy bundles. The mortuary cave contained 97 individuals, work that was undertaken by Tiffany Tung and her team, while the semi-subterranean structure that dates to slightly later in the Middle Horizon contained 48 individuals. So with the exception of the final dedicatory layer, the ceramics, textiles, and other objects recovered in both contexts are those that were placed either inside the cloth and cotton bunting of the mummy bundles themselves or potentially at the mummy's feet. La Real is one of the larger villages in the Middle Horizon Majes, and individuals buried in the mortuary cave, as well as the semi-subterranean structure, have richer offerings than most of those interred elsewhere within the valley. And we know, based off of work that was done at Urraca as well as at Biringa, that La Real does very much have these sort of higher elite status burials. Tiffany Tung has also identified high rates of cranial trauma at La Real's and within La Real's mortuary cave, as well as semi-subterranean structure, suggesting that likely inhabitants and individuals using the site were using it at a time where emerging elite were not necessarily shielded or protected from endemic violence within the valley. And a significant difference in lethal blows and lethal interpersonal violence by the sort of later portion of the Middle Horizon suggests that the rate of deadly attacks on elites were only increasing within this period of time. So again, a lot of social as well as sort of political upheaval that is very much evident within the bioarchaeological record. So differences in the bundle artifact assemblages between the mortuary cave and semi-subterranean structure can be used to track other ways in which Maje society was changing during the Middle Horizon period due to Wari expansion. We know that early Middle Horizon contexts at La Real reflect a desire for long-distance objects writ large. There's a lot of long-distance interregional exchange that this site is really reflecting in its material records. Wari imports at the site were common, for example, but Nazca-style trophy heads and ceramics are also found alongside other non-local material cultures, such as from highland Tiwanaku contexts. And we know imports significantly declined in the late Middle Horizon amid sort of this increasing rate of interregional interaction, as well as heightened endemic violence. But nonetheless, we know that important differences did exist within this phase of time. A major change that did occur between this early and late Middle Horizon phase was the abandonment in the use, production and use of bone aerophones. So 40 of the instruments were recovered from the mortuary cavern in situ or in slightly disturbed contexts associated with its initial discovery. And as I said, unfortunately, initial discovery of La Real from this sort of disturbed portion of the cemetery was done so in an emergency context, so the degree of recording and detail on those contexts is lacking, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we know that mammal bone aerophones were found throughout the cave and suggest that they were initially placed within mummy bundles. And if a maximum of one bone or whistle was included in each bundle, then about 41% of individuals were buried in the cave with one of these instruments, which is interesting and significant if that was actually the case. Importantly and interestingly, though, no bone aerophones were found in the semi-subterranean structure. So we know chronologically these two contexts are distinct, and within the context and through the context of looking at musical instruments, we do see a difference through time. So the bone musical instruments from La Real include bird bone aerophones made from large avian species, potentially condor, as well as mammal bone aerophones, most likely from the shape and texture, camelids, but we do have the possibility of potentially deer contributing to these contexts, just because of the diagnostic portion of the bones being completely abraded away. In general, bird bone aerophones are manufactured from wing long bones, specifically ulnae, and then the process involves removing the epiphyseal ends of the long bones, and then the shafts are perforated with 3 to 4 holes, varying in diameter from 2 to 5 millimeters, while bird bone aerophones have gourd or mate stoppers placed at each end. Mammal bone aerophones are made from an artiodactyl species, again, most likely from camelid. And in general, mammal bone aerophones are manufactured from long bones, so a range of femorae, tibiae, radioulna. From long bones were in the epiphyseal ends, so the ends of these bones were first removed. The diaphyses, the shaft portion, is squared off and rounded in some instances, and the surfaces are smoothed. And then four perforations are added to the actual shaft or diaphysis of this specific bone element. And there's a common layout. It's really interesting when we were undertaking these analysis, a very, very strict, relatively strict layout in where the perforations are made. And there's a relative standardization in the size of the perforations. So the common layout of perforations, with the central perforation being the largest in a range of about 8 to 10 millimeters within the central shaft. And then these subsidiary perforations near the ends, as well as directly below that central perforation of 2 to 5 millimeters in diameter. So most of the worked bone aerophones are finished objects, with about 44% of mammal bone aerophones completed, and the remaining either intentionally broken, about almost 20% of the assemblage, or still within the actual manufacturing process, about 40% of the assemblage. For the bird bone aerophones, about half are complete. There are only 6 fragments of bird bone aerophones. Half of them are complete, and the other half are intentionally broken. And it looks like there was a single method used to make the bird bone aerophones. There's a lot of diversity in how the mammal bone aerophones were used. There's 3 specific types, manufacturing kind of types that we identified. The first is on the image here, where you can see that the long bone shaft is sawed at both ends. The actual shaft is then rounded down, chopped and polished. And then in stage 3 and 4, there's further polishing, perforations are made, and then the finishing and smoothing of the actual aerophone is undertaken, and then the mate stopper is added. You can see an example of a separated mate stopper in the image here. So we know that based on our analyses, that there is an relative extensive use of these instruments. You can see extensive polishing along the actual perforations, so both around the smaller perforations as well as around the larger perforation. And we know in the particular case of this example here, made from a camelid femur, that there is active use and working both of striations as well as polishing throughout the actual structure of the instrument itself. The second type of manufacturing that we were able to identify is type 2, where we have a similar set of stages where you have the epiphyseal ends removed, the ends of the actual shaft that are processed, worked down, the ends are removed, and then through stages 2, 3, and 4, you have the eventual rounding of the shaft, perforations are added, and that finished polishing as well as use. But in the case of type 2, there's extensive burning to grade 3 burning, where we have several hundred degrees Celsius that is the bone is being heated to, and then you have this dark coloring of the bone. And this is happening early on in the manufacturing process. It's not something that's happening afterwards. Stage 3 is one where we see the 4 stages that are being undertaken to produce these bone instruments, and then they're being burned after the fact. And you can see that it's very clear based off the sort of the uneven burning. You have sort of brown hues as well as these black charring that's being applied to the bone within type 3. So that's significant for separating out both intentionally burnt through the process of manufacture, as well as intentionally or unintentionally burnt within the context of likely the mortuary practices through which the bone is actually being offered within. Nonetheless, these three kind of rough types that we identified were significant to start to think about why and when these different types of stages were being applied. So we identified those three types of manufacturing, and then I am someone that is very interested in the materiality of musical instruments, as someone who's trained in archaeological methods, trying to understand why specific resources are being used. I would never claim to be a musical specialist, so other people in this space will know a lot more about this than me and my collaborators. But nonetheless, we had at our fingertips really interesting and useful tools to record the acoustic capabilities of these bone aerophones. So we did conduct auditory analyses by playing the instruments in different forms, both with all of the perforations covered, all of them open, and in different hand placements. And I wanted to share a couple of those recordings from you. If you downloaded the supplemental files from our publication, it's in the supplemental files, so you can have those recordings at your fingertips. But we did conduct and were able to conduct auditory analyses on 15 complete bone instruments, mammal bone instruments, specifically from the La Real assemblage. And it was not possible to undertake any analyses on the bird bone aerophones, unfortunately. None of the three complete instruments had their original gourd stoppers, so we weren't able to produce any meaningful auditory sounds from that. The mammal bone aerophones that could be played were separated into two categories, burnt and unburnt, just in terms of visually what we were able to identify. And these preliminary analyses conducted on the aerophones were played with all their perforations closed for the recordings that I'll share with you. So I just wanted to play them just so that we can all hear the difference. So that's the one from So you can see within those two types, the main frequency of type 1. So mammal bone aerophones have a range of about 1500 hertz. This frequency range of unburnt aerophones is situated within a very comfortable sound variation for human auditory sensibilities, and it establishes the use of bone aerophones as effective instruments for musical activities. While type 2 bone aerophones achieve a lower frequency range, around about 100 hertz, with some punctuated notes reaching as low as 250 hertz. The few type 3 mammal bone aerophones present in the assemblage can reach a very high frequency of about 1800 hertz. And broadly speaking, burning lower frequency ranges among aerophones with very sort of different ranges depending on the length of the aerophones themselves. So these variable auditory outputs create much diversity in sound production when played together, both manufacturing differently sized aerophones as well as burning some of them ensured that each instrument creates a unique sound. So participation, then we know, in musical activities involves more than just playing instruments. It requires the actual acquisition of raw materials to manufacture the instruments and includes their various stages of production and final deposition of the objects themselves. The kinds of sounds produced by aerophones in the Majes mortuary traditions thus not only gave meaning attached to moments when the instruments were played, but through the memories they evoked in the process of obtaining raw bone material and creating the instruments from them. So as I've already discussed in the early middle horizon, the shared creation of bone aerophones was likely an important part of Maje society. Working together, herders, hunters, traders, elites, and non-elites could have created music played in mortuary rituals as well as other important events, but through a collective practice. At least within the excavated context at La Real, this tradition did change, and it did, the use of bone instruments specifically did vanish by the later part of the Middle Horizon. So I have images here of condors and camelids, and we know that animal bone has been used to produce musical instruments in the Andes and globally for millennia, as we had it again in our sort of pre-talk chat. The choice of bone used to make aerophones was likely determined in part by the needs of the instruments and the distinct structural properties of the skeletal remains of these specific species. We know dense mammalian long bone are useful as textile tools, for instance, but their hollow form can also be exploited for a wind instrument. The hollow light characteristic of bird bone is a relatively ready source for more delicate flutes that would have had different frequency ranges. And those instruments would have also been played in the context of divergent and unique musical aesthetics. But nonetheless, individuals producing and using bird bone as well as mammalian bone would have been aware of those properties and drawn from those resources to produce specific types of sound. Um, I wanted to just reiterate a couple of things specifically as it relates to condors. We know that they're the largest flying birds in the world, inhabiting the Andes range as high as, or one of, sorry, the largest flying birds in the world. And they would have inhabited the Andes mountain ranges as high as 5,000 meters above sea level. They have a wingspan of over 3 meters. The species dominated these high altitude skyscapes, and they would have been prominent and were prominent in the worldview of many Andean societies in both their worldviews, their kind of ritual practices, as well as in their artistic depictions. So we can think about the different types of interactions between humans and camelids, ones that would have been more regular based off of herding traditions, while the interactions between humans and condors would have been much more restrictive, and likely only in the context of either ailing condors or potentially when condors were descending to consume carrion, as they are carrion birds. Camelids would have been a really important source of fiber, a source of meat for feasting rituals, as well as feasting events. And we know that their use in different contexts within the Andes, and specifically at La Real, would have been significant. I put here an image of another context within Latin America, specifically in the Oaxaca region, from the late formative period, of a deer femur, indicating the ways in which large mammals would have been intersecting with different ideas of the environment and different worldviews in other parts of Latin America, but specifically how deer as wild species within this region of the southern part of the North American continent, how that would have been an important source potentially of raw materials, but also as an important medium for different symbolic activities for the specific region. At the end of the day, a musical instrument must be made before it's played, and the intentional selection of bone as raw material possibly relates to its structural consistency, but also the shared labor to procure as well as fashion specific instruments. Throughout Latin America, people have made music using bone instruments for millennia. And we know that camelids are a large animal that would have provided kilograms of meat following butchery. This amount of meat is also more than enough for a single family. So often the slaughter of camelids is tied to feasts involving extended community networks and likely multiple different IUs. Sharing meat between households likely fostered these reciprocal relationships, again, thinking back to these Andean concepts of Aini, that ensured future gatherings where different families would have held the responsibility to offer their own animals in these feasting events. The close association between humans and camelids, a type of social construct in many ways. If anyone has read Christina Armstrong Oma's work, who argues for these sort of new types of relationships that are formed in the domestication of different animal species, nonetheless would have added these symbolic meaning and symbolic weight to the relationship as the family of these and different families involved in these events were sacrificing their own animals and potentially animals that they would have seen as individuals, as persons, and maybe even extended members of their own households. We know based off of our calculation of minimum number of individuals, at least 14 camelids were butchered to make the bone aerophones found at La Real. That's a lot of meat to have been shared among communities at the site. Each almost certainly represents one of these communal feasts where camelids were likely raised by one household and shared with other households who were not necessarily involved in the upbringing of those animals. If an animal's identity did remain known throughout the event, then each animal's voice could have potentially been remembered. The consistent layout and perforations, as I've mentioned, that sort of standardization in how the instruments were made, does indicate that the communities did share some sort of kind of production convention in the preferred types of auditory output in instrument manufacturing. The great variability in the length of bone aerophones, the type of thermal alterations applied to the bone, as well as decoration, did ensure that each aerophone would have sounded different. And perhaps those making the instruments did anticipate that maybe the voice of either the deceased camelid would be remembered when its bone was played. The L'Oreal aerophones may have been attached to the person that was making it. And that attachment began when work was initiated on the instrument itself. Mammal bone aerophones from all stages of manufacture were found in mummy bundles, as I've highlighted. Although we cannot know for certain if those buried in the bundles manufactured their associated instruments, ownership is suggested by both the intentional breakage and burial at various stages of manufacture. In burying the dead, the living decided that the voice to be carried through the bone, both human and animal, could no longer be heard when the manufacturer fell silent, and potentially could explain some of the destruction, post-depositional destruction that's evident at La Real. Instrument manufacturing from condor bone is less understood at La Real and within the La Real assemblage, since there are fewer bird bone aerophones. And we know that the thinner bird bone did obviously impact how they were constructed and obviously opens them up to greater fragmentation. But nonetheless, the experiences of condors, of course, were far different from those than of camelids. La Real inhabitants would not have been brushing against a condor in passing, spinning its fiber into thread, or routinely shared in its meat and feasts. Nonetheless, they would have been familiar animals based off of their calls, silhouettes in the sky, and living condors could have also been understood to have had potentially voices like camelids, but differentially valued and understood. Nonetheless, bird bone aerophones and bone aerophones more broadly were made likely with a common form in mind, as has been suggested by a similar set and organization of perforations and manufacturing steps, specifically within the case of mammal bone instruments. Deviation from form through variable length and the placement of perforations likely did give each individual bone aerophone its own qualities, and likely qualities that were intentional in practice, in manufacture and actual practice and production of musical performances. So hearing the variable bone aerophones likely together would have been a very overwhelming and impressionable auditory experience, quite distinct from listening to a few people playing in a band. What specific associations were made with the sounds remains unknown, but nonetheless, we know through ethnographic analogs that at least camelid cries are essential parts of Andean soundscapes. Going back to Henry Stobart's work among the herders of the Calanquira in Bolivia, for example, they celebrate the beginning of the rainy season as a time of release of flow, nurturing, and femininity. Llama cries are woven into the music of celebration within these contexts that enabled, quote, a flood of tears, rain, and seminal fluids, end quote, that ensures community reproduction and regeneration. So perhaps the cries of camelids and condors, channeled through the breath of people who made the instruments, had maybe a similar or maybe metaphorical similar degree of ritual importance in the early Middle Horizon Majes. The context where the La Real aerophones were played it remains unknown. Both in work and alongside my collaborators, we argue that the sheer number of performers would suggest that there was little distinction between performer versus audience member likely. 40 bone aerophones is a lot, and they were recovered from the La Real excavations dispersed widely throughout the mortuary cave. So if we assign one individual aerophone by context, then again, we have dozens of individuals that were likely participating in these musical events. And we can imagine the clapping, singing, and dancing common at events today, and at least the later part we can see within the first millennium CE rock art at the site of Toro Muerto, making music, experiencing musical events, as well as potentially participating in the production of musical instruments would have drawn people into musical practice in different ways. And we can imagine the different events used that these instruments were used, whether it be weddings, funerals, harvests, and other types of ritual events. It would have been very emotional experiences for people involved in all of those stages of manufacture, as well as eventual deposition of the instruments themselves. So examining these bone instruments as part of these larger social and economic chaînes opératoires allows us to consider the invaluable role of camelids and condors that as they played parts of extended social communities in the Majes during that early first millennium CE. And we know that bone aerophones were foundational to these ritual experiences in the Middle Horizon, and they did continue to be so and be used by people at least till about 750 CE in that mortuary cavern. So in the end, these collective musical experiences, collective musical participation were important for drawing in people in nuanced ways, depending upon age, status, gender, political affiliation, community group, IU, all of those would have really structured how people would have been engaging in these events. Camelids and condors were important animals in the worldview of many Andean societies as social actors and as emblems of elite power. They could travel great distances with access to few places that humans would know or have access to, specifically condors. And in life, these animals would have been seen as important individuals distinguished by specific markings, behaviors, and calls. So to consider and to assume that they would have been treated at sort of at the broader kind of population level rather than at the individual level maybe isn't the best way to approach interpreting this particular context. It might be more useful for us to consider individual animals and those individual relationships. Nonetheless, the abandonment of production of bone aerophones by L'Oréal's elite after the 9th century CE does correspond with this sort of rise of Wari influence in the region, whether it be the state or kind of imperial impacts of Wari. And although the Wari were in decline by about 1000 CE, the people of Majes were knowledgeable about Wari customs. And again, certain choices were made about which musical traditions did continue. The idea of a musical shaman, as I mentioned early on in my talk, as has been put forward by Gudemos, would have run counter to the collective tradition of making and playing instruments. So likely with Wari expansion, musical traditions were changing because there was an inherent tension by focusing in on musical specialists rather than having music as something that was collectively made. People may have continued to play their own music. A few canantadas or pan flutes can be found in the later Middle Horizon context at L'Oréal, but they were no longer invested or investing considerable time in manufacturing camelid as well as condor bone aerophones. And music was no longer being made together from bones of esteemed members of their communities, again, non-human members of their communities. But more people were likely listening rather than performing in the late Middle Horizon, and the music was orchestrated likely by people who, by definition, were seen as others. And the sounds of the Majes Valley were changing around that 9th century CE mark as the sociopolitical context of the valley was also shifting. So throughout this research, I hope that we can start to think about musical practice, the types of materials being used by individuals through time were shifting in meaningful ways as both a response to internal change as well as these external factors. And I hope that we can look at the meaningful ways that our interpretations as archaeologists, looking through these different frameworks, such as multi-species archaeology, can draw different types of attention towards the life histories of non-human beings and potentially non-human persons and individuals. Animals we know, and I can't it's not something I'm saying that's revolutionary, but animals were agentive forces and in some instances considered to be part of these extended kin groups, potentially extended communities in the Andes, and their recognition as not solely symbols, but as active beings and agentive forces in life to be considered in our interpretation and reinterpretation of material belongings, both of past peoples for the Andes as well as elsewhere. So I really appreciate, again, your attention and look forward to any questions and discussion we'll have. So thank you.